Music theory with Microsoft Excel. Scales built by negative intervals or negative modal distance. In other words, moving in the counterclockwise direction, comparing the major modes, including the Ionian mode, which is the major scale, the Lydian mode, and the Mixolydian mode. So get ready and some coffee because you ain't never seen rockin' unless you excel at rockin', which is what we're doing. We are in Excel. If you don't have access to this workbook, that's okay because we basically built this from a blank worksheet but started in a prior presentation. So if you want to build this entire worksheet from a blank sheet, you could begin back there or just construct the current part of the table that we're working in. If you do have access to this workbook though, 4 tabs down below. Fretboard, example, practice, blank, the fretboard tab having a simulated fretboard that we will refer to. The example tab has, in essence, the answer key. Practice tab having pre-formatted cells. So you can practice the practice problem with less Excel formatting, but if you don't have any of that, that's okay because we'll be working in the blank tab where we started from scratch with a blank worksheet, and we'll be continuing, in essence, with the blank part of the worksheet, practicing our Excel skills and music skills at the same time. Let's go on over to the fretboard tab to get an idea of what we are doing before we dive into the tools that we will use to do what we want to do. What we want to do is navigate the fretboard, visualizing it properly as a map of the territory similar to the Earth, having 7 destination locations like the continents on the planet, and having 5 non-destination locations, kind of like the oceans that we go through to get to the destination locations. Our head is above the fretboard, above this low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, looking down the fretboard, visualizing it shifting or rotating like the planet does, assigning 12 degrees of rotation, those lining up to the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. Typically, we work in the visualization 4, meaning the set of notes, 7 notes, around the C major scale. But note, we could go to C sharp to D to D sharp, and the whole thing would just simply shift up. Therefore, once I have chosen the collection of notes, I no longer want to name them by the note names, particularly because I don't want to name them by the continent names equivalent to the Nashville number system, which is also the modes. So the 1 is the Ionian, the 3 is the Phrygian, the 5 is the Mixolydian. Remember that the intervals and the chords that are built from the intervals cause us problems because the scale degree forces us to try to rename this system and kind of warps our optimal vision of the fretboard from a functionality standpoint that would work best. So we want to keep that in mind as we look at these distances. Remember that we have, in essence, 2 forms of measurements similar to inches and feet, although not exactly analogous because our equivalent to feet in this analogy are not all uniform, that being the modal distance or the scale degrees. So for example, if I'm going from this Ionian to the Phrygian, what would be the distance in our equivalent of feet in this analogy? The modal half steps, which would be 1, 2, or the scale degrees, if I make that the 1, it would be 3. What would be the analogy similar to the inches? It would be 1, 2, 3, 4 notes away. So I would call that a 4 note away, second modal half step, or third scale degree. So the question would be, well, what if I go from another continent and I go the same distance up? So the way we're usually looking at this is I want to see how many steps it would take, equivalent to inches, or oceans and continents, in order to get to the 1, 2, 2 continents up, or the third scale degree. So I want to go from to the same distance in terms of scale degrees or modal half steps, but there could be a different number of the equivalent of inches or oceans and continents, right? So this one happens to be the same 1, 2, 3, 4 distance. But if I was to start from the Aeolian, I still want to go up 1, 2 continents. So I'm going to keep that distance the same. But remember, that distance is not necessarily uniform in terms of the smaller unit of measurement here, right? Because they're not all even. So this one is only 1, 2, 3 units up. If I go 4 units up, I land in the ocean. That's in essence what we're basically comparing when we compare our scale degrees. And remember, the main important thing is the distances not the terms of like major, minor, or perfect. You could drop those completely, and I would recommend doing that if you add the note distance. Now this time we're going to go in the negative direction, so we can go from here back like a step backwards. Now remember that the scale degrees completely fall apart when you go backwards, because we don't really have negative scale degrees, but we need something to go backwards, to be able to count backwards. So that's what we're going to be building, the part of the table we'll build here. If you use modal distance, everything fits, right? I can go clockwise or forward, or I can go counterclockwise or backwards. And you need to come up with some system that works so that you can measure things from the bottom of the guitar towards the top, towards the heavy strings, and be able to count it out and make sense of what you're doing, right? So I'm going to go back over to the blank tab. So we built out our scale degrees. We had our 12 notes. We then picked the 7 notes, applying our formula, whole, half, whole, half. We've got our 7 notes then, which we're going to assign then our Nashville number system, as well as the abbreviation of the modes. And then we did our comparison the way we normally see it, meaning we have scale degrees normally, but I also added the modal distance. The scale degrees all too high by 1 because of the measuring error. And then we compared each of the points that we're looking at and built our shape around it. So if I start on the Ionian, that would mean I have an II, an ID, an IP, and so on. And then I can measure the distance between them using our, in essence, 2 measuring tools, and then the scale degrees is basically the modal half step, but mismeasured, right? So we have the modal half steps, and then the scale degrees, which are 1 higher because they're off by 1, and then the measurement in notes, and then we gave the normal scale terminology and the modal distance terminology, and then we were able to compare this from every other point, the Dorian, the Phrygian, all of the 7 nodes. If you start on the 7 nodes, what are the distances that you can go in terms of this distance remaining constant? Meaning I'm going to go up 1 continent, go up 2 continents, go up 3 continents, and then say how many steps in terms of half steps are between each of the continents, because sometimes we have oceans between the continents, so we don't always land on another continent if we go the same number of note half steps up or note and continents up. Okay, so that makes sense. This is somewhat standard. But now note these tables never go the opposite direction, because I also want to know what happens if I go in the negative direction, because I can go clockwise or counterclockwise around our lap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this up in the counterclockwise direction, starting with the Ionian. And we'll see that obviously, again, the scale degrees don't really work, and we'll try to figure out how we can work around that using that tool, and then we'll make a better tool, a measurement tool that does work, which most people don't use, but it actually makes sense. So you have something that makes sense that people don't use, and something that doesn't make sense that people use, and then you got to choose which one would be the, so I cut and pasted that up here so that I'll have that up top. And then I'm going to possibly give me more space. So we're going to need some space above here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole thing, I'm going to take this whole bit, and I could just pull it down by putting my cursor there. That's the most intuitive thing to do, but I think it's useful to practice right-clicking and inserting. And then I want to push this whole thing down. I want to push it down and go boom. And so now we've pushed it down. We might pull it up at a little bit at the end of this process. So now we're in the distances, and we're going in the negative direction now. So I'm going to make this one orange because I want to show that that's going to be like our middle point. That's our middle point, even though it's on like this side of the midline, because I'm not going to repeat it above when we go in the opposite negative direction or counterclockwise direction. So I'll make this whole bit orange. Maybe I should just do it all the way. I'll do it just this bit. Orange all the way across. That's going to be our middle point, so we can go forwards and backwards from the midsection. Okay. So now we're going to go backwards. So now we're gonna, so if I look at the scale degrees, you would think it would be like, see how this is a 1 now? The problem is it should be 0, of course. So now when I go backwards, it's like this should be what, if I was to go backwards, this should be like a -1, right? So I should repeat this and say this is a -1, but no, I'm just going to say that's either 1 or -1 on the scale degree, and then this is going to be a 2 then, a -2, and this is going to be a -3. So you would think if you used scale degrees, this would be the naming convention as you go up. It'd be -2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But most people don't do that because, again, it's all off by 1, and then it gets all messed up because the majors and perfects don't really line up going backwards in a way that's conducive or nice. So we end up having to kind of do a workaround to figure that out. Now, it works perfectly if you go back this way. You just take this -1. We could do it this way, by the way. This should be this well, we can't really do it that way. Right, this has to be -1, -2, and this has to be this -1, and then we can pull it up that way. That might be, so you can see what's happening. So I have a formula. This one, you could say this -1, and it makes sense, and then we would go in the negative direction up to, wait a sec. Well, and then this has to be this -1, and then it makes sense, and we can pull that up. Okay, so now that's going to be going -1 to 6. That makes sense. Okay. All right, so we should be able to pull this back up. So I don't need this space. So I could grab this whole thing and pull it up, but I want to use the deleting thing again. So I could go from here to here, and I'm going to go all the way across. And I think this is the better way to actually do it. So I'm going to take this whole thing and then just make sure that I haven't deleted anything. Right click. And then I'm going to delete, but this time I want to shift them up. Shift them up, boom. So now we've got this nice and tight. We can still see our Ionian up top. I'm going to build out the modal range in the negative or counterclockwise direction, noting that our lettered modal range is dependent in our table by formula to the numbered modal range. So we will start with the numbered modal range, where we have the 1 representing the Ionian mode. As we go in the negative or counterclockwise direction, it would be logical at this point to ask the question, hey, aren't you making the same error when you're numbering the modes as we're trying to fix with the numbering of the scale degrees, which are stemming from the problem of starting at 1 instead of 0, making it difficult to count in the counterclockwise direction and putting our mindset in a scale degree mindset instead of the more efficient and functional friendly distance or modal distance mindset. And you could make that argument that we should have made this 0 through 7. However, I think in this case, it's not as severe a problem for reasons I don't want to get into in a long detail right now. But I also think the pros kind of outweigh the cons. What are the pros? The pros of keeping it this way is that that's the system that people have kind of memorized for the major scale, and it lines up to what people kind of know for the Nashville number system. And they've also kind of memorized which of these numbers they can build a major or minor chord. In other words, the 1, 4, 5 are major, and the 2, 3, 6 are minor, and the 7. So they've kind of already have that put down. But you can certainly make the argument that if we're doing a pure system, that you should have made that basically a 0. So I just want to point that out as we go in the negative direction. So we're going to go in the counterclockwise. We're going to compare everything to the Ionian, which is the 1. I'm going to say this equals the 1. I'm going to copy that up. So here's where it gets weird. We're going to say, all right, now I want this one. If I go in the negative direction, if I imagine this as a circle, if I go in the negative direction from the 1, I need to get to the 7. So how can I do that with a formula? You would think it would be this -1, but that's not right. It would be this -1, but that gets me to 0. I need it to get me to 7. So I want to say it's going to be that -1 plus 7, and that will be correct. Notice that this modal range is the same as this modal range. I'm thinking of the modal range as being able to either go clockwise or counterclockwise around the circle. So in this case, we're going to be going counterclockwise around the circle. If I go the rest of the way up, it should be equal this minus 1. Then it works, right? Everything else is this minus 1. So the question is, how can I make the formula universal? I'm going to have to use a logic function, right? I want it to be this minus 1 unless, and then add the 7 to it. So unless it's less than 1, I want you to add the 7. So I'm going to delete that for now. We're going to add the if tab, and then I'm going to copy this. I want you to do to that one minus 1. So you're going to do that if it's greater than, I think it's this way, right? If it's greater than 0, then do that, then comma, then do that. But if it's not, I want you to do that and then add 7. So I think that's right. Let's see if that makes sense. So that's going to be 7. So that makes sense. Notice I can't really copy this up because it's going to be pulling the cell down here. So I'm going to have to fix it, but I can copy it this way and say now what's happening. It's pulling from the wrong cell. So if I change all these to a 7, so it pulls from the cell right underneath it, then you would think it would work. Let's try it out. So there it is. So let's copy that up. So there's our modal ranges going in the negative direction. Okay. So now I should be able to copy these and well, I should be able to copy across here and paste that. And so it's an IN. That makes sense because it's using the same X lookup that we built last time using these letters. So it should be finding that. Okay, so I'm going to copy that up. So we can say, okay, that makes sense. It's an IN and an IA and going back in this direction. Okay, so that's good. So now the modal half steps that we're traveling are going to be then. So if I take the endpoint and I went clockwise, it would be 7 minus 1. That would be if I'm going clockwise. That means if I go counterclockwise, it's going to be that minus 7. Right? So if I go from here to here, it would be 6. And if I go counterclockwise, then it's going to be negative 1. So if I copy that up, then that works, although I'm going to have to adjust that when I copy it to something other than the Ionian. I'll think about that in a little bit or a little bit later. Now on the scale degrees, you would think this would be all off by 1. So it would be this plus or minus 1. So you'd think this would be the negative second scale degree and so on, going up this way. However, we don't really have scale degrees going in the negative direction. That's the problem. One of our problems with the use of the scale degrees. But if we did have them, you would think that would be the system that we would have. Okay. All right, now look at the note distance. Now down here, the note distance was this long formula where we basically said, hey, look up the endpoint here, the D, find that, and then subtract it from the I, find that. So it'd be a 6 minus 4 going in the clockwise direction. So then we'd had to say, okay, well, what if we're going counterclockwise? I can take the 6 minus 4 distance minus 12 to go in the counterclockwise. Now this gets messier than that because this formula is also saying, well, what if it comes out to be a negative number? So we looked at that in the past. I don't want to get into it in detail again. I just want to say that formula should work up here. So I'm going to say, let's go ahead and copy that. I'm going to say, let's copy that and paste it here. So that would be an IN. That would give me a distance of 11. So all I'm going to do is say, okay, let's take that whole thing and then subtract 12, and that would be negative 1. Now I could also just take this 11 and minus 1 because it's the same modal range, right? That might be a little bit cleaner to do. But I'm just going to keep this formula so you can kind of see the calculation, even though it's a big, ugly formula. So you can see this modal range is an IN modal range, which would normally be 11 forward. That means it would be negative 1 counterclockwise. This is an IA modal range, which would be 9 forward. That would be 12 minus 9 would be negative 3. So this is an IX modal range and so on and so forth. So then what would be the names that we can apply here? So this one, this is where it gets wonky because we don't really have negative scale degrees. You would think from a scale degree standpoint, you'd have something for like a -1 distance, which might be like a minor, would be like a second or something like that, because it would be the negative scale degree, negative second scale degree. But we don't really have that, so we're usually going to keep the going forward scale degrees. So what I'm going to say is, if I went forward 11, 12 minus 11 would be a -1, and I'm still going to call it a -7. So then how can I do that with a formula? I would like this to be basically a -1 minus 7. So what I want to do is pull the in bit over here, and then pull the negative, the distance bit up in front of it. So how can I do that? I could say this would be the right. Let's pick up the right of this, and then say that I want the last 2 bits of that. So that would be a major 7. And then I want to put in front of it this negative distance modal half step. So I'm going to put in front of it this, and then I'm going to tie it together with an and. So boom. So I'm going to call that a -1 major 7. All right. So I think that works. If I copy this up, then we have that. Okay. So then over here, what I want to do, this one, the whole thing should work. So I'm just going to copy this and put it up here. And so this works. See, right now I have this whole thing works out, except I don't really like that it has another negative in front of this last bit, because I'd rather have it have this negative flow through so I don't have to put 2 negatives. Even this, because I'm going to imagine the shorter way to say this is a -1, I1. And imagine that that second one still has a negative because it's a little bit faster or easier to write that way, I believe. 1 character less, you know. So how can I get it so it doesn't have that second negative in it? So I can say, one thing I could do, I could say this one is actually 2 characters. It's a -1. So I can go into here in this last bit. I want to say just pick the right amount of that, comma, and just 1 character, and that should drop the negative. So now I've got a -1 Ionian 1, which is a little bit faster to write, a little bit cleaner. So if I copy that up, there we have it. So I think that works. So if we think about this, then if I go in the negative direction, let's make this green. I'll make this green, and see my ribbon up top. Let's make this like this green, and then I'll put some borders around this. And then, so there we have that. And then I made this yellow. Okay, let's make that yellow. Okay, I don't know why I made it yellow, but let's put some borders around this. Okay. So now let's just think about it. So if I go 1 step in the negative direction, we would go to an IN modal range. So that's going to be a 1-7 modal range. So that's going to be then a modal half step, 1 modal half step back, and 1 minus 7 would be 6 forward. It would be a -2nd scale degree if we had 2nd scale degrees, and it would be 1 note half step back. 12 minus 1 would be 11 forward. And from a normal naming convention, scale interval, -1st major 7. The major 7 really is the clockwise name instead of the counterclockwise name. And then it would more appropriately be called -1st modal half step from the Ionian. You took 1 step in the negative direction from the Ionian, which is a negative, which would be a -1, the negative flowing through. I imagine a -1 modal half step in the negative direction. And then here we'd say, okay, this is the scale degree of a -3rd. If we had negative scale degrees, it would be the -2nd modal half step. It would be an IA modal range, which we see down here as well, an IA modal range, which is a 1/6 modal range. So we would go 2 modal half steps in the negative direction, which would be a -3rd scale degree if we had negative scale degrees. And that means, and we would be going 3 note half steps in the negative direction. And if we had 12 minus 3, that would be 9 going forward. And then that's going to be a -3 major 6, because if I was going forward, it would be a major 6. More appropriately, it would be called a 3 node away from the Ionian node, negative second modal half step, and that would give us a 9 node away going clockwise, Ionian, and then 7 minus 2, fifth modal half step going forward. If we had the negative fourth scale degree, if we had negative scale degrees, it would be the negative third modal half step. That would be an xi modal range. Here's the xi going clockwise, would be a 1,5 modal range. So we have a modal half step of 3. We're going to say the scale degree would be negative 4 then, and that's going to give us then the note half step, which would be 5 notes in the negative direction. So if we used our normal naming, it would be a negative 5 notes, and it would be a perfect fifth, because if I went forward, it would be 7 note away perfect fifth. It'd be more appropriate to call it a negative 5 note away from the Ionian node, negative third modal half step, which would be a clockwise 7 notes away, Ionian node, which would be the fourth modal half step, which would be the fifth scale degree. And so if I went back to this one, it would be the scale degree would be then the fifth scale degree, or negative fifth scale degree, which would be the negative fourth modal half step, an IY modal range, which would be a 1,4 modal range. So we would be taking negative modal half steps 4 negative, and it would be the negative fifth scale degree. If we had scale degrees going negative, it would be negative 7 note half steps. So that means 12 minus 7 would be 5 going forward. So we would call that conventionally, I would call it a negative 7 note away perfect fourth, because going forward it would be a 5 note away perfect fifth. It'd be better to call it a 7 note away Ionian fourth modal half step, because then going clockwise it would be a 5 note away from the Ionian. 7 minus 4 would be third modal half step, which would be the fourth scale degree, right? So then if I was up on the next one, we have the negative sixth scale degree. If we had negative scale degrees, be the negative fifth modal half step. It would be an IP modal range. Here it is down here going clockwise. IP, it would be a 1,3 modal range. We would have a modal half step of negative 5 modal half steps, which would be the negative 6 scale degree if we had negative scale degrees, and that would be a negative 8 steps in the negative direction. And then 12 minus 8 would be 2, so it would be 2 going clockwise. So I could call then that a negative 8 note away, it would be, 4 going clockwise. Sorry, I was on the wrong one. 4 going for 8 note away major third. And I would be more appropriate to call it a negative 8 note away from the Ionian node, negative fifth modal half step, because 7 minus 5 would give us the negative 4 note away from the Ionian node, positive second modal half step, which would be the third scale degree. One more, if we had the negative 7 scale degree, then it would be negative 6 modal distance. That would be an ID modal range, which is the second one, because this one's in the middle. That's what's throwing me off. It would be a 1,2 modal range. That would be a negative 6 modal half step, which would be the negative 7 scale degree. If we had negative scale degrees, it's going to be a negative 10 distance. 12 minus 10 would be 2 going clockwise. Therefore, from a standard convention, we can call it a negative 10 note away major second scale degree. I'd rather call it, though, a negative 10 note away from the Ionian node, negative 6 modal half step, because going forward then it would be a 2 note away from the Ionian node. 7 minus 6 is 1, first modal half step, which would be the second scale degree. Okay, I was hoping to go through all the majors and compare them, but I think that is enough for now, so we will continue this. First, comparing this, I'm going to copy this over to the major modes, comparing those, and then we'll copy it over to the minor modes and the Locrian, and we'll try to go through these as we're thinking about it. And I think it's just going in the counterclockwise direction is just something, including me, we haven't spent anywhere near as much time as when we think about going clockwise. And again, our tools aren't as perfect, so that's what we're trying to fix. So we'll spend a little bit more time building this out in future presentations, and we're going to have to fix to copy it over. We've got one of these formulas we're going to have to adjust, but for the most part, we'll be able to copy this forward going forward.